Daf Yomi, Tractate Bava, 9b, starting at the top of the page. If we say it means that one should spend up to 1/3 of his estate to perform a mitzvah, but if that is so, and if it happened to him that he became obligated in 3 mitzvot at the same time, should he give his entire estate away in order to fill those mitzvot? One is certainly not required to do so. Rather, what Reb Zera said is that for the embellishment of the performance of a mitzvah, for example, to purchase a more beautiful item used in the performance of a mitzvah, one should spend up to 1/3 more than the cost of the standard item used to perform the mitzvah. Rav Ashi raises a dilemma. How is this 1/3 calculated? Is it 1/3 from within? In other words, he calculates the cost of a standard item, adds 1/3 of that value, and spends the total on purchasing a more beautiful item, or is it 1/3 from without? In other words, 1/3 of the sum he ultimately spends should be the additional sum added in order to purchase a more beautiful item. The Gemara concludes, Teiku. The dilemma shall stand unresolved. And this is the first Teiku in Tractate Bava, and I believe that it is the 118th Teiku in Shas. It's either 118 or 119. In the West, Eretz Yisrael, they say, in the name of Rabbi Zera, of the money one spends on purchasing a more beautiful item to perform a mitzvah, up to 1/3 more than the cost of a standard item comes from his own finances. But from this point forward, any additional sum spent on purchasing a more beautiful item comes from the largesse of the Holy One, blessed be He. In other words, God will reimburse him for spending that additional sum. Mishnah, with regard to anything for which I became responsible for safeguarding it to prevent it from causing damage, if it in fact causes damage, it is considered as if I actively facilitated that damage, and accordingly I must pay for it. In any case in which I facilitated part of the damage it caused, I am liable for payments of restitution for damage it caused, as if I were the one who facilitated the entire damage it caused. One is liable only with regard to damage caused to property, for which, were he to use it for a non-sacred purpose, he would not be liable for the misuse of consecrated property. With regard to damage caused to property that belongs to members of the covenant, for example, Jews, and with regard to assigned property, the meaning of which the Gemara will explain. And one is liable for damage caused in any place except for a domain designated exclusively for the use of the one responsible for the damage. And one is liable for damage caused in a domain designated for the joint use of the injured party and the one liable for the damage. When an animal or item one is responsible to safeguard causes damage, the one liable for the damage caused by insufficiently safeguarding it is obligated to pay payments of restitution for damage with his best quality land. Gemara. The sages taught in a brisa that elucidates the Mishnah's ruling. With regard to anything for which I became responsible for safeguarding it to prevent it from causing damage, if it in fact causes damage, it is considered as if I actively facilitated that damage and accordingly must pay for it. How so? In the case of an ox or a pit that one transferred to the care of a deaf mute, an imbecile or a minor, whose presumed limited intellectual capacity means they are deemed incapable of sufficiently safeguarding them from causing damage, and the ox or pit caused damage, the halacha is that since the owner of the ox or pit did not fulfill his duty to safeguard them, he is liable to pay for the damage, which is not so in a corresponding case where the damage is caused by fire. The Gemara elucidates, with what are we dealing? If we say that the Brisa deals with a tethered ox or a covered pit, which cannot cause damage in the manner in which the owner left them, then the case in the corresponding situation of fire, where he is not liable, is where one transferred an ember to one of limited halachic competence, which had it been left alone, would not have erupted into a fire and caused damage. This cannot be correct, because if so, what is different here in the case of an ox in a pit where one is liable, and what is different there in the case of the fire that exempts him from liability? There seems to be no reason to differentiate between them. Rather, the Brisa must be dealing with an untethered ox or an exposed pit which can cause damage in the manner in which the owner left them. If so, then the case in the corresponding situation of fire where he is not liable is where one transferred a flame to one of limited halachic competence, which can also cause damage in this form. The Gemara rejects this suggestion, but if so, why does the Brisa state, which is not so in the case of damage caused by fire, as one is exempt from paying damages? But this is untenable, as didn't Rish Lakish say, in the name of Chizkiah, they taught that one is exempt from damage caused by a fire only in a case where he transferred an ember to one of limited halachic competence, who then fanned it into a flame. But if he transferred a flame to him, the one who transferred the flame to him is liable for any damage caused. What is the reason? He is responsible because the capacity for it is to cause damage is certain. The Gemara returns to its initial suggestion. Actually, the ruling of the Brisa is stated with regard to a tethered ox or a covered pit, and the case in the corresponding situation of fire, where he is not liable, is where one transferred an ember to one of limited halachic competence. And with regard to that, which you said in order to reject this, what is different here in the case of an ox and a pit that causes him to be liable, and what is different there in the case of the fire that exempts him from liability? Seemingly, in all these cases, the item was not able to cause damage in its current form, so he is exempt from liability. The Gemara explains, you could answer as follows: the typical manner of an ox is to free itself from being tethered, and the typical manner of a pit is for its cover to become dislodged. Therefore, as it is negligent to transfer an ox or pit to someone who is incapable of sufficiently safeguarding them, the one who transferred the ox or flame to them is liable. By contrast, with regard to an ember, as long as he leaves it alone, it progressively dims, and the only way in which it will cause damage is if somebody else actively fans it into a flame. Therefore, he is not liable. The Gemara asks, and according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says, even if the halacha is that if one transferred a flame to one of limited halachic competence, he is exempt, It is possible to say that the case in the corresponding situation here in the first clause of the Brisa is stated with regard to an untethered ox or an exposed pit. The Gemara asks, but if so, what is different here in the case of an ox and a pit that causes him to be liable, and what is different there in the case of the fire that exempts him from liability? Seemingly, in all these cases, the item that was transferred is capable of causing damage in its current form, so he would be expected to be liable. The Gemara explains there, in the case of fire, ultimately, the deaf-mute's handling of the flame causes the damage. As if it were not for him moving the flame, no damage would have been caused. Here, in the case of the ox and the pit, the deaf-mute's handling of them does not cause the damage. Rather, the damage was caused even though they remained in exactly the same dangerous state in which the one who had transferred them to the deaf-mute did so. Therefore, the damage is a result of that person's negligence, and he is liable. The sages taught there is a stringency that applies to the category of ox as opposed to the category of pit, and conversely, there is a stringency that applies to pit as opposed to ox. The Brisa elucidates the stringency that applies to ox as opposed to pit is that if the ox kills a Jew, the owner is liable to pay a ransom to the victim's heirs, and for killing a slave, the owner of the ox is liable to pay 30 selah to the slave's master. Furthermore, in such a case, once the court hears the evidence and the verdict of the ox is complete, and the court rules that the ox must be killed, it is prohibited to derive any benefit from the ox, and from then it is considered that the typical manner of the ox is to proceed and cause damage. All of this is not so in the case of a pit that caused damage, and the stringency, in other words, the reason to be stringent that applies to pit as opposed to ox, is that with regard to the primary category pit, its initial formation, for example, its digging, is done in a manner that can result in damage, and the one responsible for it is considered forewarned from its inception. This is not so with regard to ox.